Hello, everyone. So glad you're here. So last month, Andy Knoll gave us a great overview on the intertwined history of the Earth's geology and biology. He led us through some of the details about past extinction events, specifically including the massive volcanic eruption that formed the Siberian Traps some 260 million years ago and wiped out 90% of the Earth's species, and provided some context for the sixth mass extinction being fueled, pardon the pun, by quickly rising atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So this is the perfect backdrop for tonight's speaker, architect, educator, and artist, Cristina Parreño Alonso. Cristina is at the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT, where she teaches architecture from a deep time perspective. Her research on transtectonics explores cultural and environmental implications of expanded temporal sensibilities in architectural practice. Her artistic works embody narratives told in the form of essays, exhibitions, and architectural installations that activate public spaces. Her goal is to help society appreciate the deep time significance of the architectural landscape in order to help us transform our relationships with the past and the future, with each other, and with the natural world. So, Cristina, hello and welcome.
Hello, George. Hello, everyone. Thank you, George, for the introduction. And can you hear me well?
Yes, and I wanted to, as you started, just wanted to thank you for being so flexible in transitioning to a Zoom format so quickly. So let's hope for a time soon when gathering together in person will not be an issue. So thanks for your flexibility.
Yes, no, of course. I look forward meeting you all in person, though. So I hope that happens soon. And meanwhile, thank you, George, and the team of the Long Now for the invitation. I'm very excited to be in here talking with you all today and share some of the ideas that I think are aligned with all with the Long Now. I'm going to start sharing the screen and see if it all works. Are you seeing?
Yes, we have it. Yep.
Can you see deep time architecture?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, good. So I don't see that. Okay, I can see you guys, but I'm just going to start talking to you. So as George was explaining, I'm an architect. And so I was training in Madrid, in Spain, but now I'm based in Boston. And I guess that by leaving my home a while ago and living in a very different place for so many years, I gain a perspective of time and space that somehow made me question, like kind of that I think that moving here has impacted the way I perceive not only the world, but my discipline in particular. And especially with the events that have been happening recently and the times that we are living today, I realized that architecture in the past several couple of centuries or so has been operating using the human clock, basically looking at the building only from the perspective of the human time and without acknowledging the impact that architecture has, like kind of in broader, it has in the earth, like kind of the idea that that it has been like kind of really narrow-minded from the perspective of time. And so for the past several years, I have been very interested in finding ways to look into longer perspectives of architecture, to foster long-term thinking in the discipline. And I have been developing this through my own work, mostly at MIT. So if we think just from the perspective of materials, for example, the built environment, which is the result of all the activities that are involved in processes of construction and deconstruction for which humans are responsible, it has acquired planetary dimensions, right? And so we can say that as a major player in the build, the power of architecture and all the material processes that it requires compares to that of geological natural forces, no? And so all these activities that come with architecture that have to do with extraction, for example, quarrying or mining, like kind of, if you think of the profound scars that they leave in the crust of the earth, or transportation, manufacturing, construction, those are responsible for a great deal of the CO2 emissions that are causing anthropogenic climate change, for instance, but then also the activities of demolition, of waste disposal that are leaving plastics, but many other non-biodegradable materials, and that are going to last for thousands of years into the future. And so somehow, like kind of these perspectives that I was talking about for the discipline, or like kind of the stepping back and looking from a broader perspective, it made me think that in a similar way that the natural geomorphic cycle in the earth is a balance of erosion, of flows of matter, of land forming, that in architecture, the built environment entails also cyclical processes that through construction and deconstruction redistribute matter in the earth, right? And so the way of thinking architecture from the perspective of these cyclical flows is what I call a deep time architecture. And so the idea behind it is mostly to bring awareness that architecture has become that geological force, and therefore the consequences need to be viewed from the vantage point of the planet, right? And always with the intention that with this awareness, it will come a different way of practice, no? That it will affect the way we architects become more conscious of, for example, where materials come from, or what is the distance of transportation, or their carbon footprint, just as a one small example of the implications, no, that this awareness may bring. And so my personal work is not so much about demonstrating a responsible way of developing what I do, but it's more so to bring awareness to these deep time ideas through projects that come in many different mediums. So I develop under the rubric of deep time architecture, I develop exhibitions, I develop material experiments, art and architectural projects, videos, I write architectural essays. So it's a material, or it's an architectural practice that is eclectic from the perspective of medium. So it's not only the building, although I've also designed buildings. And so I'm going to be sharing briefly some of the projects, but also some of the ideas, no, that I have been developing under this rubric. And so as a way to radically change the ways we think architecture, and to set the theories, no, that behind what I'm doing, I use terms from other disciplines that have inspired this way of thinking, and that I also use as lenses to look at architecture from these perspectives. One, for instance, and I'm not going to go through it, but just kind of today, and I'm hoping to make it short, just to give a glimpse of what I'm doing. So one of these terms, for example, is the Deborah number, which is used in rheology, which is the brand of physics that deals with fluidity of material. So the Deborah number is a non-dimensional number that defines the relationship between the time of observation of a material and how much that material flows, the fluidity of that material in relationship to the perception. So the Deborah number brings this idea that with enough time of observation, everything flows. And the term was coined by Marcus Reiner, who was inspired by the prophetess Deborah, who says, and I quote what she says, the mountains float before the Lord, right? Like kind of and that particular sentence made Marcus think, well, first of all, the mountains flow because everything flows. But second, they flow before the Lord, but not before man, simply because in the short lifetime, a human cannot see them flowing, while the times of observation of God are like this idea of deep time. No? So somehow here God stands for long time scales of perception. And so if we translate this idea to architecture, it essentially means that we could look at the building, or actually we should look at the building not as a static object, but the building as a moment in time where a series of flows of material are consolidated in one particular form, right? But it's a form that is temporal in a way, and so we should be defining the building or understanding architecture not just as the building, but as everything that it entails, right? That needs to happen for that building to take form, and then all that happens afterwards. Like another way in which I've been thinking these radically expanded architectural perceptual timeframes is by changing the way we think subject in architecture. We normally think that the human is a subject of architecture that transforms the environment, and the environment is the earth. Here I propose that the earth needs to be treated as a subject too, and I propose that both human and the earth are subjects of architecture, and that both need to be accounted for. And in order to account for both and to care for both, the architecture needs to operate again, no, at planetary deep timescales that relate to the earth, and then at the human timescales that serve to the communities. And so again, like here is deep time bringing responsibility to architecture for its profound involvement into the geological timescales of the earth. And then from the perspective of the human time, the idea that a more sensitive relationship to time will open architecture to more diverse subjectivities, thinking that architecture needs to serve to diverse communities, but also thinking that within the human species, or within the humans, there are differences that architecture must be sensitive to. And that also there are other species in the earth. And so the image to the right here represents the human, and then the image to the left represents these other species. So almost like kind of within the humans, there are different subjects, but then in the earth, there are other species which I claim also should be subject of architecture. So what is the relationship of architecture to nature? And so in this image this image to the left is illustrating the work of biologist Jacob von Wexkull, who has been also an inspiration for me. He wrote a book called A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans. And Wexkull developed an argument by which each organism inhabits its own distinct perceptual universe. And he called these perceptual universes Umwelt. Umwelt is one of these terms, like the Deborah number in this case, coming from biology. So that I've used as an inspiration or as a way to think other time scales, or how time could change the way we think architecture. So for Wexkull, the same environment is manifested in different Umwelts depending on the subject who is perceiving it. And so each of the species in the planet has its own Umwelt. And within, again, as I was saying before, within different humans, there are different Umwelts, right? Like, kind of, we as humans don't perceive the environment in the same way. But then if we consider the Earth as a subject, as I was suggesting before, there should be also an Umwelt of the Earth too. And what is very inspiring for me of what Wexkull proposes is that he says that time varies from one Umwelt to another according to the amount of, or the number of moments that are experienced by different subjects in the same span of time. So Wexkull says that there is not one time only that there is as many times as there are subjects. And he says that each subject is contained in its own environment, which possesses its own time. And so for me, the idea of the Umwelt was this idea that by acquiring a more sensitive relationship to time, architecture opens to a more diverse set of subjectivities and therefore a broader conception of agency. This is an image of Wexkull's book, A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans. And what he's showing here are images of the same street perceived by different subjects. First as perceived by a human, then seen by a human through a screen, then as perceived by a fly, and finally as perceived by a mollusk. And so in his book, Wexkull extends an invitation to his readers to step into unknown worlds of the unwealth of other organisms. And he calls it to take a stroll through invisible worlds. To take a stroll through invisible worlds means here to enter another dimension of time in order to see through the lens of the mollusk or to see through the lens of the fly. So in other words, is to enter another dimension of time to see through the lens of the other, right? And so coming back to the idea of the Earth as a subject, and how do I ground this idea? So in 1789, geologist James Hutton coined the term, which is the father of geology, known as the father of geology. He coined the term superorganism, claiming that the Earth is one such creature. And with this term, superorganism, he is describing a condition by which independent individuals are so integrated that they possess features that are equal to a single organism, including collective cognition. And so from this perspective, and following Hutton's assertion, the Earth could be conceived as a new subjectivity, a sort of macro-perceptual system embedded in its own Umwelt, which, as every other Umwelt, has its own time. And so what is interesting here is that it was, in fact, James Hutton, who in his theory of the Earth, published in 1788, presented the first account of deep time. And indirectly with deep time, he's presenting to us a new temporal dimension, the temporal dimension of the Umwelt of the Earth. Before James Hutton, the Earth was thought to be 6,000 years old, and it was in this place, in the Siccar Point in Scotland, where he used the evidence from the rocks to decode the Earth processes and to argue for a much greater length of geological time than what was popularly accepted. And so this idea of the Earth as a superorganism that Hutton was presented inspired also Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock's Gaia theory, the Earth as a goddess. So the Earth becomes as a subject, the Earth is a superorganism, and the Earth as this goddess. In the book, The Ages of Gaia, James Lovelock says that Gaia, as the largest manifestation of life, the Earth as the largest manifestation of life, differs from other living organisms of the Earth in the same way that you or I differ from our populations of living cells. And so if we think like all the bacteria and all the organisms that make us. And so if the Earth is a superorganism with her own perceptual system in her own environment or an Umwelt, then what I have been speculating is with this possibility that architecture borrows this macro-perceptual system in order to expand its timeframes. And an evocative example of this idea is the image of the black hole that we humans have recently been able to see. And we have been able to see the black hole thanks to a perceptual engine at the scale of the planet. And this perceptual engine is called Event Horizon. So Event Horizon is a network of telescopes that are linked from Greenland to Antarctica, and they all together create this sort of super camera that has an aperture as wide as the Earth. And so if we conceive the Earth as a superorganism, we could think the planet, we could think the Event Horizon Telescope as a perceptual organ, a sort of eye at the scale of the Earth, and the Earth that is now a subject that is able to see the black hole that is 55 million years away. And so now I'm going to show a project that works with this idea of thinking the Earth as a perceptual system that enables us to consider wider spans of time in architecture. It's a conceptual architecture / art project that is called Tectonics of Wisdom, the Libraries of the Earth. And this project explores 9 ancient library buildings, which, like the example of the Library of Papyri that you see in the screen, are examined as nodes of very long and short time trajectories. And these time trajectories go from the geological scale, the scale of the empire, the scale of the city, architecture, as in the building, the human time scale, the material temporalities. And so each of these timelines contain different stories of different events at different times that are told by different subjects. No? So the idea that the building of architecture embodies all these subjects. And so on one hand, the project proposes a new way of analyzing architecture, where the building, as I'm saying, is thought as an intersection of time trajectories that incorporate deep timescales. But then on the other hand, and because these libraries are spread across the globe, and because they are spread across different time periods, the idea is that they all together form a deep time library that can tell us stories at the scale of the Earth. It's almost that by reconstructing the architecture of these libraries from a geological perspective, we recover deep time stories, not only from the books and from humans, but also from the materials of the architecture, from the materials that made the architecture, right? And so in Tectonics of Wisdom, each library is characterized by a deep time event. And these are geological, environmental, historical, cultural, material events around the library building and the book. And so these material events are new lenses to look at architecture from geological timescales. And so in the Library of Papyri, for example, to go to the same library, Mount Vesuvius volcanic eruption in year 79 became a material event that destroyed the library, the library as the building, but it kept its papyrus scrolls in a time capsule hidden under ash and lava until they were rediscovered 18 centuries later. And so in this project, Tectonics of Wisdom, thinks the geological maps of the eruption of the volcano as ways of representing architecture, right? Like kind of almost architecture needs to borrow from geology in order to account for its connections with deeper timescales. And so Tectonics of Wisdom is a project that is multimedia, is in the making. And during this process, I'm developing a series of snapshots to share certain aspects of it. Through exhibitions and essays. One of these snapshots is this installation that was exhibited in the Shushev Museum of Architecture of Moscow in 2020, right before the pandemic. And it was a display of the first 5 libraries reenacted through 5 material prototypes that I call tectonic books. And so these tectonic books are like material representations of each of the libraries. The book as a material event, no? They are made with volcanic rock, with aluminum, with ink, and here is the material as a medium to bear narratives of events. Here, made with clay, for example, the tectonic book of the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, a library that was set ablaze 27 centuries ago by the Mongols, and it was a fire that destroyed the library but baked its tablets, preserving them for millennia. Or this one here now in the screen is the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which books were thrown into the river, also by the Mongols, turning the waters of the Tigris back for weeks. And so the Tectonics of Wisdom, then it will have a book with that will describe each of these libraries, kind of a way of redefining the discipline of architecture, a new approach to analyzing the build, expanding what constitutes the building. And so here you see like kind of the different libraries that we are looking at, the different material events that essentially these material events connect the human timescale with the geological timescale that are important to tell the story of architecture, and then the different timelines used to develop that. The next project I'm going to show is an art installation that was selected by La Biennale di Venezia de Arquitectura in 2021, is currently on view there. And the project is a collaboration with the Department of Geology at MIT, where they are studying a new technology to transform CO2 into volcanic rock in a very short period of time. So the project started with a commission by the National Forest Corporation of Chile to design a small carved space in the volcanic basaltic rock of Patagonia to serve as a small refuge for the scientific community that comes to study the problem of climate change there. So Patagonia is made of 90% volcanic rock, and this project started with the premise that all the carbon in the earth derives from rocks and that it will end up in rocks at some point. And this is a cycle that naturally takes millions of years. But new cutting-edge technologies have radically shortened the time spans that turn CO2 into basalt. Carbfix is one of these technologies. It's a pilot of Carbfix is a pilot of these technologies that is being developed in Iceland. And in 2016, Carbfix was able to calcify for the first time CO2 into basaltic rock in a period of 2 years. So Carbon to Rock, this project is an art installation that speculates with the architectural consequences of these new artificial manipulations of geological timescales of the carbon cycle. The idea that volcanic rock can become a material that embodies the imbrication of human and planetary processes. It's an installation in Venice that speaks about the project in Patagonia, presenting the volcanic rock as this new possible resilient material for construction that will be able to produce in the future architectures that store CO2 through their materiality. And so the piece was constructed in Spain in the factory of Cuellar Stone. That they have incredible facilities to work with marble. They had never worked with volcanic rock, so we were experimenting with them, and then brought the piece in the work into pieces to Venice, where we put it together. And so these are some images of the overlay of the volcanic rock over the texture of the architecture of Venice, and the framing of the architecture of Venice as seen through that volcanic rock. And so together with this installation, that again is like kind of something that was really trying to bring awareness to the possibilities of an old that could become new material. But together with the installation, we developed a video that was used as a sneak peek by the Biennale in their website. And the video presented the idea of the igneous rocks as a new subject. The igneous rocks as the narrators of the carbon planetary story, the rocks that come to us claiming all the carbon that we humans have extracted from them. And in this case, the rocks as the subject of the story, with the message give back, give carbon back to rock. I'm going to play. It's a super short video, so I think it's worth checking. If you don't hear the music, let me know. Maybe it's you should be hearing it. Okay. So, well, I have another project, George. I don't know how we are doing in terms of time. If that's it, should I stop here or should I present one more project?
Hi, Christina. This is George. That was stunning. So we're all kind of back on our heels from that video. Just take a minute and explain. You had this installation in Jamaica Plain, and it's still there, right?
It is going to be built.
Going to be. That's right. And do you know when that installation is going to go in?
It will be a permanent art project, and so we like the idea is that it starts construction sometime in the spring, and we don't have the exact date. We are going to present this to the Boston Art Commission in a couple of weeks, actually. So it's really in the making. But the idea is that it starts, the construction starts soon.
And why don't you give a quick description of what you're going to be on display there?
Yeah, so I can try to go through this very quickly. It's a competition that I won a few years ago to design a project in Hyde Square in Jamaica Plain, and in order to talk about the idea, to bring identity to this site, and that's what the community was asking for. And so the project is about telling the stories of Jamaica Plain, but thinking that Jamaica Plain is a conglomerate of stories and subjects that made it so diverse. It's a very diverse neighborhood in Boston, and so some of these stories that we want to talk about have to do with obviously neighborhood of immigrants. No, the idea is to talk about the stories of the Irish and Germans that came in the 1800s, or the immigrants from South America. The stories from the people, but also it's about the stories of the geological narratives, no, like prior to the appearance of humans. Jamaica Plain is encroached in a geological formation that is called Paddington, that is also known as Roxbury conglomerate. And so we also wanted to bring like kind of the deep time stories of the site, so that the thing that is grounding the humans of this community. And so the project consists, and very quickly, on 3 artifacts that are distributed across the square, and each of them it has a base made with an earthy material that speaks about those geological stories, and then a series of transparent poles that speak about the human stories. And in the base, we talk about the immortal materials, the all immortals, fossils and rocks that talk about, that are recordings of the geological stories of the place. The new immortals as well, if we think about plastic agglomerate rock, this new rock that is bonded with plastic, or also plastic, that are new materials that also will bear the narratives of humans after our civilizations. And then in the transparent poles, there are stories that will be collected and archived in different types of materials through interviews of people from the community. And so each of the installations, it has these narratives at different scales, no? Like kind of either this one, for example, is about planetary and human. The base is made with air-cast concrete, talking about the tectonic layers, no? That is the way the Earth tells time, with the layers, the tectonic layers, and it has embedded fossils. And then in the poles, there are a series of ceramic pieces that speak about the human origins in relationship to those of the Earth and the surrounding landscape. Then the other installation highlights the intersection between the geological timescales and the human. And so in this case, the base is made of that padding stone. Is also called Roxbury conglomerate, and it's a stone that has been in JP for 600 million years. It's a stone that has made the foundations of every house in JP, a stone that has bears all these narratives, but at the same time, it will serve as a platform to tell the human stories that are grounded in this land. No, it's like kind of a way to express how geology enter human landscape and build environment. And the lower part of the poles also has a collection of stories that are more human oriented. And then the third installation is more about the future, about climate concerns and hopes. And the base is made with plastiglomerate. Is this new anthropogenic stone. Is a new type of rock that actually was announced in 2014 by the Geologic Society of America. And it's one more of those instances where humans have entered the geological landscape. And in this case, the lower part of the pole will contain objects donated by the community that are made with plastic, well, telling the story of the human, but more from the perspective of the materials that we use.
Wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. Cristina, thank you. That was amazing. The images are so beautiful and so stunning, and that video was such a compelling story. I also feel, coming from you, a real passion being presented in these works, and the passion that you bring to what you do is very inspiring. So it brings me to a question I have for you to share with the group here. A couple of questions. What drew you into the field of architecture? And why did you find your way to that as your area of passion?
So that's such an interesting question. For me, what brought me to architecture was actually what's keeping me in architecture, and it's the idea that architecture for me it's a way of thinking the world differently, and this is something that. So for me, architecture was never about designing, or not only, it's also about designing buildings, but not only. My uncle was an architect, and his office was in the same building back in Madrid, where I was born. And my cousin and I used to enter his office, and I was fascinated by the things that I would encounter there that was so unexpected. And it was like models and objects that sometimes had nothing to do with finalized buildings, but were what my uncle was using in order to design those buildings. And they were beautiful geometries, interesting abstractions. Also, my uncle was an incredible person in terms of the way he looked at the world and the things that he would share with us. And so there was something about his character and the aura that was around him, that this mysterious way of seeing things, that I thought it was very compelling to me. And the thing is that when I entered architecture, it was very much what I was expecting. In the School of Madrid, really what I learned was ways of representing the world that help us see the world in new ways, right? When you draw a map, you are not really trying to represent exactly what it is. You are trying to project, right? It's an act of world making somehow. And I think that's something that I feel it's driving still the way I think architecture, as a way of changing our perceptual frames. Right now it's temporal, but it doesn't need to be temporal. It can also be spatial, right? For us, this idea of this map by the artist Joaquin Torres, Inverted America, that he takes the South America and inverts it, and all of a sudden you see the map, and then you realize that the north up way of seeing maps is a convention, right? Like kind of that's and it actually changes the way we perceive a space. So it's also spatial, no? It's like kind of a way of changing perception, temporal and spatial. Now I'm finding the temporal aspect of it extremely inspiring, and I'm working on it. But the space, of course, is important.
And so the idea of creating that expansion of perspective or the shifts of perspective to be able to see things differently, you know, where do you hope that will help us go? How would you express that?
Well, I think that goes everywhere, because that will take us everywhere. I think that's needed. I think the world now needs big shifts, big changes, and it needs for us to dismantle conventions, things that are very ingrained in the way we think the world. And so I think everything can benefit from these new lenses of thinking. Like kind of if you think, for example, how in maps, like kind of the Western world is always represented in the center, right? Like kind of and the Mercator opens up the world in like kind of leaving certain parts of the world aside that like kind of are supposed to be less important from the more Western conceptions, right? Like kind of culture. And I think that's like kind of a small example, but I think that really changing the way we, or like kind of even the idea of north up, south down is also like kind of not only thinking about maps. It always puts like something above something else, right? Like kind of, so the idea, for example, NASA, the blue marble is like the way it was taken, the photograph of the blue marble was taken the other way around, not the way that we normally see that image. But NASA took that photo and reversed it so that we all see it in the way we are used to see the world.
Right.
That the Earth
North
is
is north
floating.
is up,
North is up,
north is up,
exactly.
south is
South is
down.
down, right? But the Earth is floating, right? Like kind of, can we really forget about those conventions so that we open up perspectives? And yeah, so I think that but then also, of course, like kind of if we think about the way we tell history, right? Like kind of it's rooted in deep conventions of who is on who is the subject, right? Like and what are the stories that are relevant that will make it to history, right?
Yeah.
And I think those challenging all those conventions will help us be more open, be more inclusive, be more diverse, care more for the planet, care more for each other.
Yeah, I'm struck. I'm reminded of the what's called the Copernican revolution. You know, prior to Copernicus, people thought that the Earth was at the center, and it's now a trope to say, oh well, the Copernican revolution changed all that. The Earth was no longer at the center, so we're no longer, don't have that hubris of believing that we're at the center. But you point out that the way architecture relates to the environment, it is still pre-Copernican because it puts humanity at the center of this relationship. And you're trying to change that so we understand it's not just for humans, it's embedded or part of a bigger picture, and ultimately that blue Earth, which is such a stunning picture. I was also reminded of the way you talked about the fascination with kind of the rocks and the objects in your uncle's office, and that reminded me of something from a book I read, and the author is in the room tonight, and Bina, I hope, if you don't mind, if you could unmute. This has been Bina Venkataraman, from the Boston Globe, was a former speaker here. Bina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
So,
What a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Christina.
yeah, I just wanted to mention,
Bina.
Bina, that, you know, I have this by my desk, so it's there. This is Bina's book,
Great.
The Optimist Telescope is fantastic. And Bina was our featured speaker March 2nd, 2020. Do you remember that time period?
I do. It was one of the last in-person events. I don't think it was the last, but it was one of the last in-person events I did before everything shut down.
Yeah, it was the last one that we did. So, yeah, that was quite amazing. What I was thinking of when Cristina was talking about these objects, I was thinking about your comment, your theme in the book about heirlooms and things that have an intrinsic value. And I wonder if you'd just speak to that for a minute, and then, you know, feel free to ask a question of Cristina.
Sure. I have many questions for Cristina, actually, but the concept of the shared heirloom is this idea that we have these objects in our personal lives and in our families that we pass along, right, generation to generation. I have such an object. I have an instrument that belonged to my great-grandfather. But for me, I think there's a powerful sort of metaphor in that for thinking intergenerationally across deep time, in that we need ways to anchor ourselves both in the present and across these really large temporal scales that Cristina was talking about. And we have to have some sort of epistemic humility about what it is to think across deep time. We're not going to be able to imagine what the world is like many generations into the future with any kind of reliability, except for the fact that we have really good long-range climate models. There's some exceptions to that, of course, but in terms of technology and how that will transform the world, what people will live like, where they will live, what languages they will speak. The oldest languages now are just a few thousand years old. So we really have to look across these timescales with some humility about what we really can predict and know. And the idea of a shared heirloom or some of these objects is that if you can have concrete things that you can pass generation to generation, you have the capacity to actually engage across longer timescales in some concrete way that each generation can create its own meaning with, without the sense of needing to control or knowing that you're going to leave a time capsule for the future that the future will know about. But I'm so curious, actually, as this relates to libraries, Cristina, because I really loved your presentation about the tectonics of wisdom. Is that the right term?
Yes.
Of wisdom, and the libraries that you looked at, and you looked at the geology of the libraries, because I think of libraries as kind of stewards or even shared heirlooms themselves, because they are sort of institutions that over time shepherd knowledge, shepherd books, shepherd objects. And so I'm just curious if you now, when you reflect on what you know about these libraries of the past, including those that have been preserved in some form in ash or burned, if you were designing a library today, thinking about deep time and thinking about the past and what we know of these libraries, what would you be thinking about if you were trying to envision that library in a sort of more deep time way?
So it's so interesting, no? Like kind of the theme of the library, how it relates to the past in the way as like what you're explaining, Bina, like kind of the things that are transmitted through libraries, and in that sense, I'm interested in the materials and the things that we can learn from the libraries. But then, if I were to design a library today, I think I would relate the two timescales, the human timescale and the geological timescale. And I think today the human timescale or the library in the human timescale has a lot to do with what the library can do for communities and the library as a social infrastructure, right? Like kind of the idea that the library is not only holding stories through books, but also through the activities that take place in the libraries, and the idea that, I mean, if you think libraries, they 10 years ago, we thought the libraries were going to disappear just because all the books were going digital, right? And I remember there was a moment when, okay, like what's going to be the future of the library? I remember that we were designing a library with my students 10 years ago, and the big question was, what is going to be the future of the library? They are going to decide what is the library as an institution. 10 years later, we know that the library is the most used public space in the city. And the reason is because the library has been resilient and it has been able to adapt and acquire other programs, right? And I think that now, if I were to design a library, I would start thinking about what a library needs to be today from the perspective of its service to the communities. And then from the perspective of material, I guess that to me, the connection to deep time, as I would design a building, would be its care for the care for the earth, right? Like kind of, or how do you construct it? Like kind of, in this case, I would bring the responsibility of the architect, and how do you build with local materials? How do you build with like kind of a carbon footprint that is responsible? And so this type of questions that where the deep time perhaps it's contained in what we can do now, right?
I think it's so interesting. Oh,
I'm sorry, I wanted to pop in for a second. We had a speaker that was talking about libraries in a different context. That was several years ago. Nova Spivak, the founder of Arc Mission, who their mission is to construct billion-year libraries, but it's not from the standpoint of building community. It's from the standpoint of simply having the contents of a library in a format that will last a billion years. And interestingly, one of the best mediums they have for storage of lots of quantity of information, small spaces, is DNA itself, which of course cycles back to life. But the thing that was missing there is what you pointed out, and that's the role of libraries in terms of the community and the coming together of the community. And that is something that's a very human side of what you're trying to do. And you talk about materials, but you're really also speaking to the human side.
Yeah, what is interesting of libraries is that they have this double component. It's an archive, right? But it's serving communities. And the library as an archive is such an interesting. A lot what I'm interested when I look at the libraries of the past is them from the perspective of archive, but thinking that they are archives not only by archiving those books, but also that they archive stories through other means, no? Like, for example, the materials of the buildings themselves, right? And then there is also these other types of libraries, like, for example, the seed library that is trying to keep seeds of every single species for the future, right? So that eventually when those species go extinct, they are stored somewhere, right? For future generations.
You were asking a question and I interrupted.
Oh, I was just going to reflect on something that Cristina said, which is, she said, thinking about local materials and then thinking about the JP project. When people say local, like in the environmental or climate arena, when people say source locally, they tend to mean things like, use local people, locally grown timber and things like that. But the way you're thinking about local is also this deep geological history, right? Like looking at the Roxbury pudding stone or the conglomerate and looking at these materials that have been in a place for like way before the people were there, which I think is really interesting. I'm wondering whether you, the role of an architect in helping imagine to me is such an important and powerful aspect of what it is to be an architect, because architects think of something that doesn't exist and then can manifest it in the world. And when it comes to these timescales or when it comes to the future, that's exactly what we have to do. Like we can't perceive the future right now, actually, right? So we actually need these imaginative constructions to be able to contemplate the future. And when you talk about looking at the clock, I thought it was really interesting when you were saying that these layers of strata, of geologic strata, are like, that is a deep time clock. We all know what a human clock looks like. And there are tree rings, there are things like this that could be perceived as deeper time clocks. And I'm curious for you, like, is this something that you think could be architectural objects, thinking of clocks in different ways? Obviously, there's the clock of the long now, but that is also kind of a human clock. And since we're talking with the long now community, I'm curious whether you actually think of clock in a much different decentering the human kind of way than the long now community has come to think of it with Danny and everyone's influence.
Yeah, I guess that more than a clock, I would say, or the Earth clock, I would say the Earth dial, the idea of, the clock that marks deep time would be more like a dial, right? Because it's not mechanic in a way. So I think perhaps the long now clock has to do with long term from the perspective of civilizations, right? Like kind of we are thinking about 10,000 years, which is the year of the civilization. If we think of the past or if we think of the future, that's the time span. And perhaps like when I think the Earth dial, I'm thinking more deep time from the perspective of the Earth, like not like kind of exceeding a human civilization. But with that, not to say that I don't care for humans. Like kind of I always think that both timescales need to be held together. But for me, it's a way of caring for the planet, right? Like kind of if we care for the planet, we need to care for or understand those timescales. And yeah, I mean, I think the Earth has many ways of telling time that are very beautiful, and you could say telling time, also telling stories, right? Like kind of the rocks, for example, the Siccar Point. It's a way of telling time. Like James Hutton knew like kind of how old is the Earth by looking at the rocks. Or if you think about, for example, trees, right? Like kind of also they tell time through the rings. Or if you think, for example, ice cores, like the ice cores in Antarctica, where are like kind of it's like kind of a type of Earth dial or a Earth clock, right? Like kind of is telling us what the climate was like millions of years ago, right? And so I think the Earth has its own ways of telling time and telling stories, and I think that tapping into those it shifts our perception in ways that I think are very productive.
Yeah, we had a great story from Andy Knoll last month about the geological evidence of this huge event, the creation of Siberian traps and the extinction of 90% of the species. And he said when he was going to visit in a place in China, you go up and you find your way up the wall with all the 7 billion rocks, and you get to the point where it's 260 million years ago. And that the evidence of that massive event is the thickness of a knife blade. Mm-hmm. So it's not only is it sort of the time shifts, but also translated into the physical world of the geological world. It was quite amazing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I had
that really, by the way, puts in perspective when there's like something in the news that we're covering as a disaster. It wouldn't even show up as a knife's blade, right? That really puts it in perspective.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that the time frame is it goes from it used to be a daily news cycle. Now it's a 24-hour news cycle, and then
Right.
it's minutes and seconds, and here now and gone then. Christina, I wanted to ask you kind of a closing question. We'll move on to an informal conversation. I think people have been listening intently to what you say, so we don't have a lot of questions in the chat, but we'll open it up. We'll close the formal part, and then we'll open up to just informal conversation with people. But I simply wanted to ask you, what would you hope that your work and the work of others, can achieve in the next century? What would you hope? How do you hope that will change us in the coming century?
I hope that we develop new ways of practicing architecture that are more responsible and less extractive. And less extractive from the perspective of the planet, but also from the perspective of labor and human extraction, right? Like kind of, I think that architecture has been and I take that question like kind of as an architect and from the discipline of architecture, that I feel that architecture is a very, very extractive discipline. Is very difficult to conceive it without it, because obviously you are working with materials. But if you think about, and I think that there are, so for me, architecture, and now what I talk about the architecture as a new, like kind of as the technosphere, right? Like kind of is a new global phenomenon, right? Like kind of is almost like kind of a geological paradigm. If you think other geological paradigms, they are all extractive. They all extract energy and material, but it is a more cyclical process, right? Like kind of if you think fires, or if you think like kind of the processes of energy exchange that happen with evaporation of water, and so there is extraction and there is entropy. And I think architecture, it's fine that it's extractive and there is entropy, but I think there needs to be find ways to close the cycle in ways that becomes more like a geological paradigm in a way. So anyway, to summarize, I think it needs to become more responsible. It needs to become more sensitive with the planet, with humans, and it needs to stop producing CO2 at the scale that it's producing it, and finding ways to even absorb CO2 with materials, or like kind of, so really climate is an important hope.
Well, we hope with you that we will get there, and your work is helping us to make those steps that we need to take that step forward. So thank you very much, Cristina, and Bina, thanks for joining us. It's fun to have you. So we're going to close the formal part of our program, but everybody's welcome to hang around and just, chit chat over the next 20 minutes or so. So I think I'll turn this over for a minute to Anurag.
Thank you so much, George. And a special thanks to our speaker, Cristina. A huge thank you to all of you for joining the conversation tonight, both in person and on Zoom. I hope you found it rewarding. At this point, as George mentioned, we're moving into the informal conversation session. But first, just a couple of closing notes. Please remember to visit our website, and stay in touch with us on social media. Please consider joining as a member if you have not already. We also want to thank the production team tonight for a great job. Gary, Mary, and Kim, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Anurag. I think if people wanted to go to the gallery view, you'll get to see everyone else who's in the room. Most people are probably, you can get your libation if you want to. And would love to have any questions or comments that people have to offer tonight. It certainly was, Christina, a wonderful stretch of the mind to try and grasp the many dimensions. If you think about dimensions, we think about dimension, the three dimensions of space, and then the one dimension of time. But as you talk about the relationships that exist between, different perspectives, different ways of seeing things, now we're into a multidimensional process that can be kind of hard to grasp. So it's and that's, I think, where your art really comes in, to try and get the mind to expand so that you can kind of embrace those things simultaneously, the multiple layers of time that you can look at. You can look at Jamaica Plains from the perspective of that local history and the way those buildings were made. One of the things that came up in the Boston housing session we did 3 years ago was about the social climate in the 18th and the 19th century that created the environment for Boston to, I think it was, increase its population tenfold with the triple deckers. And I know there's triple deckers in Jamaica Plains. So there's you could look at it from that perspective of history, but then you also go to the rock. And, so there's so many different layers of time that you can look at something with. It really is kind of difficult to hold in with your mind. So I loved hearing that. It was great. Anybody else want to chime in?
Kim has his hand up.
Kim is muted. Kim wants to ask a question, but he's muted.
It's a hardware mute.
How's that?
Very good.
Better. Hey, Cristina, thanks so much. That was so cool. So great to have you here. The things that I was thinking about were that just came to mind randomly were when we were talking about how we look at the world. I was thinking of Bucky Fuller's Diaxion map and how that takes the Mercator projection and tears it up and throws it out, and it's not a globe, but it's just looking at the world, which way is north, kind of thing. North is north, it's wherever you put it. So thanks for introducing that. And George, thanks for mentioning Nova Spivak. He's very important in this with the libraries and the printing on the wafers and how much he's putting in there, where he's just throwing the knowledge. It's a different way of thinking about a library. The last thing I was thinking about was a book that was seminal by Lawrence Halprin called The RSVP Cycles, where he talks about architecture and the way that it impacts us. So not something like the famous Boston City Hall, but kind of the total opposite of that. And what you're talking about is how do we look at this and really play with it as a tool to react to respond to Mother Earth, as it were, and taking the stardust, moving it with the rocks. Very cool. Thank you very much.
Anyone else have a question?
I can go. I was wondering, Cristina, if how could we encourage people to kind of make this perceptual shift to Earth scale ontologies, through architecture. Right now, our architecture kind of is boxy, kind of landed somewhere in the middle of these concrete jungles or these concrete blocks landed in the middle of Earth, in a way. Nothing to do with the surrounding landscape, but also if it's very individualized, it's very at the scale of the individual. So it kind of in some ways encourages individualistic thinking. And so how could we think about daily architecture and not just architectural milestones to be more linked to earth style and ontologies, as well as more deep time oriented?
Well, I mean, I think that there are many different types of architecture. So yes, there is the architecture that lands, as you are saying, and has nothing to do with the landscape. But also there are very good architectures that are really connected to the land, and that are really sensitive, and that are really working with communities to build things that are, again, good with the planet, with the human. Look, I'm always like kind of thinking about those two. And so it's true that in certain cultures there has been like kind of this mainstream of the human clock that I say, or the modern times, that talks about architecture driven from the single author, right? Like kind of the author of architecture is like kind of the master or the star architect that designs in a way that is a little bit disconnected, not from all these perspectives. So I think that to me it's like kind of how do we bring a new type of consciousness to both the people that make architecture, and then that how these new works of architecture also can transmit like new values to the citizens, or not transmit new values, but like kind of like kind of encourage new ways of engaging, right, with the space, with materials, and with architecture.
One of the things that strikes me about a lot of the architecture we see and the things that are famous and the tourist attractions and all that is that they are really symbols of power.
Yeah.
And they were used for domination and impressing and scaring and, and then, or prisons. And that certainly doesn't have, I mean, I think what you're talking about is trying to change that dynamic. So it's not creating a power dynamic, but it's creating an embracing and an embracing ethic that brings community in and enlivens community. Linda.
Cristina, that movie was so powerful. It was not only emotional, but it was spiritual. And I feel that I just felt like it needs to be shown in every science curriculum in high school, or maybe even as young as middle school, because it's beyond even architecture. We've lost contact with the reverence for the world and the earth, and it was so good. So if you can personally, our granddaughter is in a school of just 25 girls out in Colorado. She opted for that this year. And if there's a way that I could find out to get that video for them, but it's really powerful. It needs to hit people it needs to hit people who are in middle school and high school, not just adults.
Yeah, what was impressive is that it's giving voice to the rocks. You don't necessarily think about that, but it's giving voice to the rocks in a very personal way. And there's been a lot of talk about, kind of giving voice to the water, or giving voice to life, or, people sort of speaking from that standpoint. And like in New Zealand, the move to give the waters and the rivers personhood status, kind of elevate their status to personhood. But actually speaking from the rocks was really, really very powerful. And if you, that's the link. You've included the link in the video. Yeah, yes, wonderful. Yes. That's great. Thank you so much.
There's another kind of architecture that that came up in other talks that we've had that was not permanent. Those temples, what is the cycle of those temples that are rebuilt regularly? It's a cultural transmission of knowledge. Like
it's 20 years.
20. Okay, I thought it was even.
The temples in Nisa.
Cristina, what's your favorite building? Do you have a favorite building? Something that you like to go back to and just be in, a space that you like to be in?
I think, I mean, it's a tough one, but like kind of the first one that comes to mind, and one that I enjoy is the Alhambra of Granada, and I think it's perhaps because it does connect with, yeah, the Alhambra is one of these places that is really architecture, and it's really connecting you with the earth in every possible way. Through the relationship to water, the relationship to light, the relationship to, and also it contains, or it tells time, right? Like kind of time in many different ways. It has gone through so many transformations across the years that like it has become its own living being, no? And I think that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's something that long-lived, good buildings, well-built buildings can serve multiple purposes across time and carry with them, they can generate a life of their own as they go.
Yeah.
That would be
Another one-
wonderful.
It's also
Another-
tied very close to the rock there, right on top of the promenade there, right? Boom. The Alhambra is tied close to the rock.
Yes. And then another one that is interesting in from this lens is the Mezquita Córdoba Mosque, which is now a church, and it was a mosque that was extended, and every time it was extended, it brought columns from other temples, from other cultures, and so it's like kind of this palimpsest that through the columns, the materials of the columns, it has embodied histories from many different places, right? And yet when you are in there is this sense of unity because the grid is the same, the placement of the columns is the same, so it's all unified, and yet it's all built with so many different you feel it, energies, and obviously the style of the columns and the material of the columns is diverse. And then there is a moment when all of a sudden they did like kind of a cut in the middle and they inserted this cathedral, and so it's like kind of, it's really like kind of a building that it's telling it's telling time in very fantastic ways. But then going back, Kim, to when I love that you brought the idea of the Buckminster Fuller map, the Dimaxion. I think that's one of these great examples of how we look at the world in a different way, actually much more accurate than what we were used to, right? But that it looks so strange. And I've worked a lot with the Dimaxion, and in fact, at the base of my piece in Venice, there is a world map that is a Dimaxion, but it's a transformation of the Dimaxion. So we got inspired by Buckminster Fuller, and we changed the way the world is represented, and in this case is represented based on the tectonic faults. The Atlantic, or not Atlantic, every ocean has like kind of this ridge, right, like kind of where basalt is being constantly produced, and because the piece is all about basalt, like kind of we were rethinking the world from the perspective of the production of basalt. So it's not about the continents, but it's about these tectonic faults, and it completely changed the geometry of the Dimaxion. We call it the igneous Dimaxion.
Oh, that's fascinating. And you've
Very
also does the Carbon to Rock exhibit? Actually, that reminded me. Neil Stevenson was virtually in Porter Square last week, and his focus in his new book, it's a science fiction, is on the concept ultimately of getting carbon out of the atmosphere back into the earth as rock, which is something that something that you hearken to. And in his conversation, he talked about kind of the different layers of how we are going to respond or not to climate change. And the immediate priority is to stop putting more carbon out there.
Yeah.
But even then, we've got the issue of what's already there. And in the conversation with the gentleman who was there, he's a promoter of geoengineering, and they agreed that geoengineering can, by putting sulfates in the atmosphere in an appropriate manner, can hold the temperature of the Earth down from getting to more dangerous levels. But it's a temporary solution because you have to keep doing it. So the only permanent solution was the one of finding ways to take the carbon out and get it back into the rock, which is a lovely concept of life cycle thinking that I think that's a place we need to get to, and that exhibit talks about that.
Just a quick comment, and I enjoyed very much, Cristina, the presentation. And it's not a real question, and it's just a statement that I'd be very curious as to what some of your principles are in teaching this in your architecture, with the notion that it seems that these principles around materiality and humanity and connectivity and that apply to anything. And if you look at transportation, and you look at infrastructure, and you look at the bigger questions in front of us of necessities that take up an enormous amount of resources. And that's one of the things that was very interesting about the solar geoengineering as opposed to the carbon capture argument, that the solar geoengineering takes very little resources. It begins working very quickly. But there's a very high risk to it. Whereas with carbon capture, there's an enormous investment in resources, and it takes a very long time for it to come online. But once it comes online, you only need it probably for a few years. And now you've got this obsolete infrastructure that's sitting there, that's enormous investment, enormous construction, if you will. And just problems like that, taking a deep time perspective and applying principles to the problem would be, I'm a sucker for looking for those heuristics. And so again, this is more of a comment than a question. If anything, it's a rhetorical question right now, but I'd be very curious how you evolve your curriculum around deep time thinking and architecture, and how that can be extracted for use in other general problems.
Yeah, I think like all those questions of solar geoengineering or carbon capture or geoengineering in general, I think it's a tough one, right? Because I think that when George was saying like the example of creating like kind of this veil, like kind of in the atmosphere, so that like kind of it prevents from heating up, and that is not only temporal, but that it also can have very negative consequences, right? Like kind of so it's and I think that even the carbon capture could have negative consequences that we don't foresee right now. So it is all very speculative. This seems to be one of the examples that seems to be the least has the least negative effects in a way. But I don't think for what has been seen and like kind of when we have been working with CarbFix and learning from their learnings and seeing that it seems that calcifying CO2, the way they have it is it's an infrastructure that is not that complicated, that is next to geothermal plant. And so if the geothermal plant comes with like an infrastructure that inserts CO2, it could become like kind of something that is possible, or at least this is what they are trying to think. But I think all these are ideas that come to the curriculum in not as a, okay, this is what we need to do, but as a way of think in many possible ways. And for me, geoengineering is a tough one, and is one that we need to look at as with caution. So it's not something that I would implement, although my students have worked with theoretical notions of like kind of absorbing CO2 and closing cycles of architecture, etc. But always having like kind of this grain of salt. I think that
Sure.
be cautious.
Yeah, I was not suggesting that. I was just interested in general in the principles of what you're doing, which is fantastic. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. The principles, George, in the principles that I am doing, it's what I'm imparting, or like kind of what I'm sharing with my students is mostly like kind of that critical attitude, and try to really perceive, like kind of come out of conventional ways of seeing the problem. Like kind of, for example, if you think of climate change, and it's precisely this, like kind of, if we think of climate change very quickly, and if we think of it from conventional perspectives, we are trying to solve things. And I think geoengineering comes from this very narrow-minded way of trying to solve. I feel that deep time, or like kind of this way of thinking that I'm bringing is trying to think different ways of framing the problem. So it's more like kind of the epochal consciousness of the philosophers from the 30s, where it's not really about solving it, but really learning that we don't even know how to propose the problem, or how to outline the problem. And I think this is something that we need to, that requires people thinking about the problem before offering solutions.
Cristina, just to follow up on Bill's question, it's, one of the questions is, how do you build the capacity for long-term thinking into the educational process? And I'm wondering if you know of any other professors in your field or other fields that are kind of following of trying to teach long-term thinking in their respective fields, the way you are in architecture.
I mean, I think deep time is a term that connects many disciplines. If you think philosophy, if you think anthropology, if you think geology, the deep time, and for example, deep time in geology, I think there are many books that are coming up now that are translating the deep time thinking of geology for people that are not geologists, in order to give us like kind of this sense of looking at the world from other perspectives. But also art. There have been also many artists trying to or also music, right? If you think some works of music that are meant to be played for 600 years. So I think deep time connects many disciplines, and I think there are very interesting cross-disciplinary conversations that can come across this topic. And so I think there's many people doing.
Right. That strikes me, Bill, that is something to put out there, potentially to identify individuals in the Boston area in different disciplines that have a similar kind of deep time focus, and then try and assemble is it a curriculum? Is it a workshop? Is it a way of trying to extrapolate the learnings in those different fields, and then develop something that applies across multiple fields? And we've sort of talked about this, but I think it's
it's sort of the notion. It's somewhat the notion. Well, one of the ways that we were talking about it was when we were talking about Long Now Boston as being essentially a learning tool. Is Long Now Boston a learning tool for the community? And if so, how do you reflect a set of principles and standards and principles and standards that can sort of reflect the deep time perspective
Right, and maybe principles and standards isn't the right way to think about it.
Well,
because
standards is maybe principles, but
yeah,
not.
yeah. So that's a way for us to think about moving this conversation forward on, and as Wendy pointed out, middle school is how to build the concepts in a way that resonates across those. So I think there's some fruitful conversation in the future about maybe how to reach into your discipline and other disciplines to try to pull together some conversations around how you would develop something that we then, Long Now Boston, could help to plant in the soil and help nurture it going forward.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and it's getting late. I think we've gone past time. Cristina, thank you so much for your energy and your passion and your thoughtfulness and the ideas that you brought to us. It was a great conversation tonight.
Yes, thank you.